When a former MVP speaks, people usually listen. But when he sounds angry instead of nostalgic, the league tends to get uncomfortable. That's exactly what happened when Cam Newton turned his attention to the Atlanta Falcons' latest coaching decision. This wasn't a casual take. This wasn't a mild disagreement. Cam went straight for the jugular, calling the hire something far bigger than a football mistake. In his eyes, this wasn't about playbooks or press conferences. It was about culture, about community, and about a pattern he says the league keeps pretending not to see. Atlanta isn't just another NFL city. It sits at the center of one of the most culture-driven divisions in football, a place where identity matters as much as wins and losses. That's why this hire landed differently. And that's why Cam's reaction felt less like commentary and more like a warning. Because the moment Kevin Stefanski's name entered the conversation, Cam didn't talk about schemes. He didn't talk about records. He went somewhere much deeper. He brought up Shedeur Sanders. He brought up Cleveland. And he brought up what he believes was a quiet but damaging failure to support young black quarterbacks who come from authentic cultural backgrounds. Now, to be clear, these are Cam's claims, not official findings, but the force behind them is impossible to ignore. Cam's central question wasn't complicated. If a coach allegedly mishandled a quarterback like Shedeur in one city, why would Atlanta believe the outcome would be different now? Especially with a young roster, especially in a city where the fan base expects more than surface-level understanding. And once Cam started laying out the numbers, the roster context, and the repeated quarterback turnover, the conversation stopped being emotional and started becoming uncomfortable. Because this wasn't framed as one bad season, it was framed as a pattern. That's what makes this moment explosive. Not just what Cam said, but what it forces people to confront. If he's even partially right, this hire isn't just questionable. It's symbolic. And once you see why Cam believes that, the Falcons' decision stops looking like a fresh start and starts looking like a gamble with consequences far bigger than football. This hire didn't land in a vacuum. It landed in Atlanta. And that detail matters more than most people outside the city realize. The Atlanta Falcons aren't just another franchise on the NFL map. They're rooted in a city that sees itself as a cultural capital, not just a sports market. Atlanta sits at the center of the NFC South, a division often described as one of the most culture-driven in football. Identity, representation, and community connection carry real weight here, sometimes as much as wins and losses. That's why the reaction was immediate. When the Falcons announced Kevin Stefanski as their new head coach, the response wasn't just debate about scheme or resume. It felt personal. And that's exactly what Cam Newton tapped into. In Cam's view, this wasn't a neutral football decision. It was a choice that ignored where the team is, who the fan base is, and what the city represents. Atlanta is Cleveland, and pretending those contexts are interchangeable is where the tension starts. Cam framed the NFC South as almost an HBCU-style division of the NFL, a space where black quarterbacks, black stars, and black culture aren't side notes, but central pillars. Whether people agree with that framing or not, it explains why this hire felt different here than it would have somewhere else. In Cam's eyes, the Falcons didn't just hire a coach. They imported a philosophy that already raised questions elsewhere and dropped it into a city where those questions hit louder. That's why the conversation escalated so fast. Fans weren't asking, "Can he call plays?" They were asking, "Does he understand us?" And once that question enters the room, it doesn't leave quietly. Atlanta's fan base is deeply invested in young talent, in growth, in players who feel connected to the community. So when Cam brought up past situations involving young black quarterbacks and alleged mismanagement, the concern wasn't abstract. It felt like a warning shot. This is why the backlash wasn't subtle. This is why it wasn't patient. And this is why Cam didn't soften his tone. Because from his perspective, the Falcons weren't just making a risky hire. They were signaling that cultural alignment was optional, that history didn't matter, that context could be ignored. And whether that's fair or not, perception is powerful in a city like Atlanta. This wasn't just about football fit, it was about identity fit. And once that line is crossed, every decision gets examined through a different lens, one that doesn't care about press releases or official explanations. Which is exactly why this moment exploded the way it did, and why the conversation only got louder from here. This is where Cam Newton stopped speaking in general terms and got specific. When Cam Newton explained why the Falcons' hire bothered him so deeply, he didn't point to a playbook or a press conference. He pointed to one name, Shedeur Sanders. According to Cam, what happened in Cleveland wasn't just poor quarterback management. He believes it was something more damaging, a situation where a young quarterback, deeply connected to Black culture and identity, never received a fair opportunity to succeed under Kevin Stefanski. To be clear, these are Cam's allegations, not official findings, but the way he framed them is why the conversation exploded. Cam didn't say Shedeur failed. He said Shedeur was set up to fail, mismanaged, underutilized, put in positions where growth wasn't the priority. And in Cam's view, that wasn't accidental. He suggested it reflected a deeper disconnect, a lack of understanding or willingness to understand the type of quarterback Shedeur represents. That distinction matters. Cam framed Shedeur not just as a player, but as a member of the culture. Someone who carries himself with confidence, authenticity, and roots in a Black football lineage. And according to Cam, that authenticity was treated as a problem instead of an asset. He warned that when organizations don't understand that background, they often try to fix it, strip it down, mute it, or blame it when things don't click immediately. Cam argued that's exactly what he saw happen in Cleveland. Again, these are Cam's interpretations, but they resonated because they fit a pattern many fans already debate quietly. When young Black quarterbacks struggle, the conversation often turns faster toward attitude, leadership, or fit, instead of development and support. That's the core of Cam's accusation. And that's why the Falcons' hire raised alarms for him. His question wasn't emotional, it was logical in his eyes. If this coach allegedly mishandled Shedeur once, what assurance is there it won't happen again? Especially in a city like Atlanta, with a young roster and a fan base that's deeply invested in cultural representation. Cam wasn't asking the Falcons to relitigate Cleveland. He was asking them to learn from it. And by ignoring that context, he believes the organization walked straight into a mistake they'll have to answer for later, not just on the scoreboard, but in trust. Because once players and fans start questioning whether opportunity is equal, the damage goes far beyond wins and losses. And that's the warning Cam was trying to deliver, whether the Falcons wanted to hear it or not. This is where Cam Newton stopped speaking in hypotheticals and went straight to the resume. According to Cam Newton, the issue with Kevin Stefanski isn't personality, culture, or press conferences. It's development, or more specifically, the lack of it. Cam's argument is simple but sharp. When evaluating a head coach, especially one tasked with leading a young roster, the first question should be obvious. Who actually got better under him? Not who survived a season, not who had a good month, who left his system clearly improved. And in Cam's view, that list is uncomfortably short. He pointed to a pattern that's been discussed for years around Cleveland. Quarterbacks came in with promise, some with pedigree, some with upside, some with opportunity, yet none emerged as a stable, long-term franchise answer. Cam framed this not as bad luck, but as repetition, the same outcome, over and over, regardless of the name on the jersey. That's where the common denominator argument enters. Cam referenced the widely cited number that circulated online and in media debates. Roughly 13 different quarterbacks cycled through during Stefanski's tenure. Whether fans agree with the exact framing or not, the takeaway remains the same in Cam's eyes. When turnover becomes constant and development never sticks, eventually, the spotlight shifts from the players to the system. Every coach misses on a quarterback. No coach misses on all of them without questions following. Cam also pushed back on the idea that isolated success moments should override the larger picture. Playoff appearances get mentioned. Individual games get highlighted. But Cam argued that those moments don't erase long-term stagnation. A strong roster can mask coaching issues for a stretch. Eventually, the cracks show. What bothered Cam most wasn't failure, it was stagnation. Players didn't leave Cleveland sharper, more confident, or more established than when they arrived. They left uncertain, reset, starting over somewhere else. And at the quarterback position, the most critical role in football, that's a red flag you can't explain away forever. Cam's point wasn't that Stefanski can't coach at all. It was narrower and more damning. He questioned whether Stefanski can build quarterbacks rather than manage them, whether he elevates young talent or simply cycles through it until something sticks. And that distinction matters deeply for Atlanta. Because when a team is young, potential is fragile. Development isn't optional, it's the job. Systems either nurture it or suffocate it. Cam believes the evidence points in one direction. That's why this hire alarmed him. Not because of one season, not because of one player, but because patterns don't lie, and the Falcons may be inheriting one they weren't prepared to confront. The part that truly set off alarms for Cam Newton wasn't just who the Falcons hired, it was who they already have. Atlanta isn't rebuilding from scratch. This roster is young, explosive, and stacked with players who are still forming their professional identities. That makes coaching influence more powerful here than almost anywhere else. When a team is this early in its timeline, the margin between growth and stagnation is thin. And that's why Cam called this hire dangerous. Look at the core. You've got Michael Penix Jr., a quarterback whose success depends on confidence, rhythm, and long-term trust from the system around him. You've got Drake London, a receiver whose ceiling is tied to scheme consistency and quarterback development. Kyle Pitts is still one of the most physically gifted mismatches in football, but only if he's used creatively and consistently. And Bijan Robinson is the kind of talent you build an offense around, not rotate through philosophies with. Cam's concern is simple. This roster doesn't need a manager, it needs a developer. Young teams don't survive constant resets. Every new system asks players to relearn terminology, timing, expectations, and roles. That's manageable for veterans. For young stars still learning how to win at this level, it can stall progress fast. That's where Cam sees the risk. Based on his critique, Kevin Stefanski's track record raises questions about whether young talent actually ascends under his leadership or just exists within it. Cam isn't saying these players will fail. He's saying the environment matters, and Atlanta's environment just became uncertain. The irony is hard to miss. The Falcons are inheriting a roster that's already ready to rock, as Cam put it. This isn't a blank canvas. It's closer to a nearly finished painting. And the wrong brush strokes now don't just slow growth, they can erase momentum that took years to build. That's why this hire feels backward to critics. Instead of matching a coach to the roster, Atlanta matched a roster to a coach and hoped it would work. Cam believes that's how talent gets wasted, not through lack of ability, but through misalignment. And when that happens, the consequences don't show up immediately. They surface slowly, in stalled careers, in players who look better after they leave, in what could have been conversations years later. That's the nightmare Cam is warning about. Because if development fails here, it won't be because the Falcons lack talent. It'll be because they didn't protect it. This is where Cam Newton said the conversation stopped being emotional and started being mathematical. According to Cam Newton, even if you remove culture, identity, and philosophy from the discussion entirely, the numbers alone raise serious questions about Kevin Stefanski. And that's what made the Falcons' decision harder for him to understand. Cam pointed out that Atlanta didn't fire their previous coach because of potential. They fired him because the results weren't good enough. That's the standard franchises claim to live by. But when you compare recent records, Cam argued the logic starts to fall apart. Based on publicly available win-loss data from the last couple of seasons, Stefanski's results in Cleveland were no better, and in some stretches worse, than what Atlanta was trying to move on from. In Cam's words, that's not progress, that's recycling. And then came the stat that turned the critique from uncomfortable to damning. Cam highlighted that during Stefanski's time in Cleveland, the Browns cycled through roughly 13 different quarterbacks. 13. Different systems, different skill sets, different backgrounds, yet the outcome stayed the same. No clear franchise quarterback emerged. No long-term development success story to point to and say, this is the proof. Cam's argument wasn't that every quarterback should have worked. That's unrealistic. His point was that when none of them work, the spotlight has to move. At some point, it's no longer about the ingredients, it's about the chef. Supporters of Stefanski often point to that playoff appearance as evidence of competence. Cam didn't dismiss it outright, but he challenged the context. He argued that roster strength played a major role and that short-term success doesn't erase long-term stagnation. One season doesn't override years of inconsistency, especially when development at the most important position never stabilizes. That's what made this hire feel backwards to Cam. Atlanta didn't bring in a coach trending upward. They brought in one whose recent resume raised the same questions they were already trying to escape. And when you're inheriting a young roster, those questions matter more, not less. Cam's takeaway was blunt. If the Falcons were truly prioritizing progress, the record should have disqualified this move before culture even entered the conversation. Because when performance doesn't improve and development doesn't stick, history has a way of repeating itself. And in Cam's view, Atlanta just ignored every warning sign that was already on the page. This is where Cam Newton made it clear the argument was never just about wins and losses. In Cam's view, the real issue sits at the intersection of culture and system. And what happens when the two don't speak the same language? Football systems aren't neutral. They reward certain traits, certain personalities, and certain styles of leadership. When those preferences go unexamined, they quietly decide who gets patience and who gets labeled a problem. That's the tension Cam was pointing to. According to Cam Newton, young black quarterbacks who come into the league with confidence, cultural identity, and strong personal brands often get judged differently. Not always overtly. Sometimes it shows up as shorter leashes, fewer adjustments, less benefit of the doubt when things don't click immediately. Cam wasn't arguing that systems are intentionally hostile. He was arguing that many are rigid. And when a system is rigid, players are forced to adapt to it instead of the system evolving to maximize the player. That's where Cam believes things went wrong in Cleveland under Kevin Stefanski. Not because of one decision or one season, but because of a repeated inability to meet quarterbacks where they are. From Cam's perspective, culture isn't about slogans or optics. It's about understanding how players communicate, lead, and respond to pressure. When coaches misinterpret that, when confidence gets read as defiance or authenticity gets labeled as distraction, development suffers. That's why Atlanta matters so much in this conversation. The Atlanta Falcons don't operate in a vacuum. They represent a city where culture isn't a side note. It's central. And Cam believes that when you place a rigid system into a culture-forward environment without adjustment, friction is inevitable. This is where Cam's warning becomes broader than one hire. He's not saying systems are bad. He's saying systems that refuse to bend eventually break players instead. And when that happens, organizations often blame the individual rather than the framework that failed to support them. That's the pattern Cam says he's seen too many times. In his eyes, this isn't about accusing anyone of intent. It's about accountability, about asking whether the environment you're building actually allows young talent to thrive, or simply survive until they're replaced. And that's the heart of the debate. Because if culture and systems stay misaligned, the fallout won't be immediate. It will show up quietly, in stalled growth, in players who look better elsewhere, in questions that surface years later about what could have been. That's what Cam is really challenging Atlanta to confront. Not whether this coach can win games, but whether the system he brings can truly serve the people who have to live inside it. When you strip away the emotion, the sound bites, and the social media noise, this moment comes down to one uncomfortable reality. This hire wasn't just about football. For Cam Newton, the Falcons' decision signaled something deeper, a choice about priorities, about what an organization values when it claims it wants progress, and about whether lessons from the past actually matter when it's time to make the next move. Atlanta didn't bring in an unknown. They brought in a coach with a long, visible track record, a track record that comes with questions about development, adaptability, and trust. And according to Cam, those questions should have mattered more than they apparently did. That's why this conversation won't fade quietly. Because even if you disagree with Cam's tone, his core challenge still hangs in the air. When patterns repeat across different players, different seasons, and different situations, at what point does responsibility shift upward? When does the system get examined instead of the individuals moving through it? This is what Cam forced into the open. He wasn't asking Atlanta to relive Cleveland. He was asking them to learn from it, to recognize that young, culturally connected players don't thrive in rigid environments that refuse to adapt, to understand that development isn't just about scheme, it's about trust, patience, and alignment. And in a city like Atlanta, alignment matters. The Falcons don't just represent a team, they represent a community that expects more than surface-level commitment. Fans want to believe the organization understands who they are building for, not just what they are building. When that belief cracks, skepticism fills the gap fast. That's the real risk here. Not one losing season, not one failed experiment, but erosion of trust. If the hire works, this moment will be remembered as noise over reaction, emotion, controversy without consequence. But if it doesn't, this clip, this critique, and this warning will resurface. And it won't sound dramatic anymore. It will sound prophetic. That's why this debate matters now, not later. Because once players start questioning whether opportunity is equal, and once fans start wondering whether culture is being ignored, the damage isn't measured in wins and losses. It's measured in belief, and belief is harder to rebuild than any roster. So the question isn't whether Cam Newton went too far. The real question is whether Atlanta listened at all. Because this hire didn't just set a direction for the Falcons' playbook. It sent a message. And the league is watching to see what that message actually becomes.